Hello and welcome to the History Show on Near FM. My name is Cathal Brennan, and as always I'm joined by my co-presenter John Dorney. On this episode we will be looking at the 1913 lockout in Dublin. To discuss this, we are very pleased to be joined by Pádraig Yeates. Pádraig Yeates is a journalist and a historian. He is currently public relations consultant to the trade union SIPTU. Pádraig, you're very welcome to the programme.
Thanks, Cathal.
Do you think the 1913 lockout still has a hold on the public imagination?
I'd say it's faltering. Up until 20 years ago, I think most people in Dublin would have had some idea what was involved. But, I mean, there's been so many changes in Irish life, and historical memory has faded so much. I think the vast majority of Dubliners now probably have a very hazy idea what it was about, if they have any idea at all. And that's one of the reasons why we want to commemorate it next year.
Could you give us some idea of the political situation in Ireland at the time that the dispute took place?
Yeah, in 1912, the year before, I'm sure many listeners know, the Third Home Rule Bill was passed, which would give Home Rule to the whole of Ireland, but there was this huge controversy about it. The Unionists in Ulster were threatening to resist by force. So that dominated the agenda completely. And what was unusual, I suppose, about 1913, when the lockout dispute blew up, was for the first time ever you had a major urban dispute, a major Labour versus capital dispute overshadow everything else in Irish history and in Irish politics, and it became the talk of the day. And for the better part of 6 months it dominated the political agenda. So it was a first. It was the only time really in that decade of commemorations that are coming up that the sort of traditional political and religious allegiances of people were undermined.
And internationally, Pádraig, wasn't this also a time of labour militancy and new ideologies of socialism and syndicalism arising?
It was. I mean, Larkin, who would have led the lockout, was himself a syndicalist. In fact, he began with a greater belief in the power of politics to change society. But it turned out he was a convert, and he decided that the trade union movement was the best way to change society. And when he created the Transport Union in 1909, it had a very broad agenda. It wasn't just about winning better paying conditions. It was also about creating a better life for people and gaining control of the economy in the interests of ordinary working people. And that's that approach has never completely gone from the Irish trade union movement. So there's always been that sort of syndicalist streak to it, even though it's receded in more recent times. But he always believed that politics was too important to be left to politicians.
This is not only an Irish thing. I mean, there's a syndicalist union in France, there's one in Spain, and they're very militant. And also in Britain, where syndicalism itself is not so important, but there's a wave of strikes. There's a general strike in Liverpool. So can you say something about the wave of labour militancy that's sort of sweeping Europe at the time?
Well, I suppose it was the mobilisation and unionisation of the unskilled and the low-skilled. Unions had been around, I suppose, since the time of the pyramids, but in one form or another. But certainly in the early 19th century, it was skilled workers who formed trade unions. They tend to be fairly conservative. They're looking for better paying conditions, but they also were protective of their craft, of their skill. They knew that by controlling the numbers entering an industry, the number of engineers or tailors or plumbers or whatever, you had some control on the wage rates and conditions. They weren't really interested in, if you like, the lower classes. They would have regarded themselves as sort of lower middle class, and they would have looked down on people who were labourers, for example, or messenger boys or women workers in particular. And it was only when those groups began to mobilise, the people needed a message to mobilise them with, and it was primarily a political message. It wasn't just about, can we get an extra penny an hour by going on strike? It was, can we change society? And a belief grew across Europe and North America that industrial action could actually be used to change society. That if you had a general strike, and if you brought everybody out, the capitalist system would collapse. And once it collapsed, fairly peacefully, you could then assume the heights of power, and the working class could assume power and take over and run society in the interests of ordinary people. That was the belief. Any of the general strikes that took place actually became failures. But at this stage in that experience, people didn't know that. And Connolly would have been another man who would have believed very strongly in the power of a general strike. And you could argue that it was the failures of leadership that led to that defeat of the general strike tactic. But at this stage it was an aspiration. Before you could have a general strike, you had to get everybody into unions, and that was what Larkin was about. He was trying to recruit dockers and carters and transport workers generally, and other workers, into one big union that could then bring down the capitalist system.
And could you talk about the living and working conditions for Dublin's poor and Dublin's working class at that stage, and particularly in relation to other industrial cities in Britain and even in Belfast?
Yeah, they were truly awful. Dublin had the highest infant mortality rate in these islands, not just in these islands, but I mean, famously people compare it with places like Naples and Calcutta and Moscow. It was multiples of what it was in British cities or even in Belfast. And if you go through the different social classes, the infant mortality rate was something like 22 times higher amongst unskilled workers and their families than it was amongst the professional classes. So it was very much a class-related thing. And it was because people lived in tenements, which was still in existence in fairly large numbers up until the late 1970s, early 1980s, when, as a result of the Tony Gregory deal, a lot of them were the last remnants in the north inner city were destroyed. But you had families living in one room, families living in cellars, families living in attics, which made it impossible to live hygienically. And a lot of the disease was preventable. Milk was a big problem. Adulterated milk was very common in Dublin. People don't realise it now, but there were literally hundreds of cow parlours in Dublin. There were piggeries in Dublin. Sometimes they were side by side. So the chances, the opportunities for infection were very, very high. And that remained a problem long after the First World War was over. But the Cowkeepers Association, as they were called, were a very powerful lobby in the city, and they could usually lobby the councillors into not passing laws, or when they were passed, the fines were very, very low. But adulteration of milk was a very common problem, and infection. TB, intestinal complaints, dysentery, diarrhoea, these were all big killers of children.
And when we read about that period, as you're talking there about the quality of housing, the quality of food, heating, so on, infant mortality, one of the things you always read is about complaints from the upper middle classes and the employing classes about rates and taxes, and it seems incredibly heartless when you're looking at these conditions and comparing them to Calcutta, that there was a wealthy element in Dublin that wouldn't countenance improving conditions because it might have meant an extra couple of pence on the rates.
Well, it's resonances of today in a way, because you've got to remember that after the Act of Union, the economy in Dublin, unlike practically every other large city on these islands, was actually in decline. So you had a situation where there was less and less wealth being created. So if you were a property owner, the value of your property was falling. I mean, it fell by similar, percentages to now, and the rateable value, it was the only city, I think, in these islands that the rateable value was falling year by year. So if you bought a couple of tenements as a sort of a pension fund for your old age, if you're a middle class person, and you saw the rent dwindling from those apartments, and your capacity to repair them would fall, the condition of the apartments would deteriorate, the value would fall, your ability to carry out those repairs would fall still more, your ability of the tenants to generate any income for you would fall. You're in this sort of terrible spiral of decline for nearly 100 years. And the Irish Party fully supported these people, because you've got to remember that there was a qualified property franchise. Even after the 1898 Local Government Act in Ireland, you had to own property over a certain value, or you had to be a lodger in a property over a certain value for a certain period to have a vote. So a lot of the people who lived in these tenements didn't have a vote. The people who paid the rates did have a vote. So if you were a councillor, you were going to work on behalf of the people who voted for you, not on behalf of the people who didn't even have a vote. So it was quite similar to today in a way, and you can see the same sort of fracturing in society. Everybody's badly off. If everybody's income is falling or is in crisis, the natural instinct is to look after yourself first and everybody else second. It's only in the British cities you had much better conditions because they had economic growth going on, and there was surplus wealth, and you could afford, in the magnificent sort of buildings you have in Belfast City Hall or Liverpool or Birmingham, Manchester, these magnificent monuments to civic pride were impossible in Dublin. Dublin just didn't have the money to build them.
Well, we always remember the dispute over the Hugh Lane Gallery, and people refusing to pay extra to...
A halfpenny on the rates would have built it. They say £22,000 would have built the gallery. The paintings were estimated at that time to be worth about £66,000. It would have transformed the centre of Dublin, all right. But people like William Martin Murphy, who was a leading employer and ratepayer in the city, said, why are we going to build an art gallery to provide a show house for Hugh Lane when we could spend the money building houses, which was a bit rich coming from someone who always opposed increases in the rates for houses and who was a slum landlord himself. But this was the argument that was tried out. We don't have any money, but if we did have money, the last thing we'd spend it on would be an art gallery. So we're millions of pounds, or billions maybe, worse off as a result.
And you mentioned William Martin Murphy there, of course, from the trade unionist point of view. He's the baddie of the piece. Can you say something about him?
Well, it's very hard, and I've tried, believe me, it's very hard to find something good to say about William Martin Murphy. He was a good father, I think. He was a very stern father, certainly by all accounts, but he was a self-made man. His father was a builder in West Cork. Murphy was sent up, he went to Belvedere College. His family would have had a very strong nationalist tradition. He always used to say that, I think it was his grandmother one day took him up to the side of the hill where they lived. His mother died when he was very young. His grandmother reared him, and she showed him over Bantry Bay, and she said when she was a young girl she saw the French fleet in the bay. So there was that strong tradition there. So he was sent to Belvedere. From Belvedere he was sent to work for an architect in Dublin. The father obviously intended he became an architect and then he'd help him with the family business, but the father died when he was 17, and he went back to Bantry and he took over the business at literally 17 years of age, and he built it up from there. His big idea was to build light rail. He built the light rail transport system. Most of those rail lines are closed now, but the famous West Clare Railway, that Percy French wrote about, was built by William Martin Murphy. When people say what a great entrepreneur he was and he created all these jobs and businesses and all the rest of it, what they don't tell you is that most of these light railways could only be built because of massive British government's subventions, because they wanted to alleviate poverty in the West and develop the economy. So they built all these railways and they paid people like Murphy to actually go and build them. But he obviously was very good at what he did. He was more successful than anyone else. He married into a wealthy Cork family, the Lombards. He moved to Dublin then, and he became involved in the Dublin one of the Dublin tramway companies. A British company came in and with an electric tram, and everyone expected them to wipe out all the Dublin companies. But Murphy actually went to America, where the electric trams, were invented, and he studied them in detail, not just from a business point of view, but he mastered the engineering aspects of it, the electrical aspects of it. He became a walking encyclopedia on electric trams, came back to Dublin, introduced them to his own company, and within a couple of years he'd bought out the British competition, and he'd united all the tramway companies in one company, the Dublin United Tramway Company, which he was president of.
Well, one of the things I think is striking in your book, Lockout 1913, was the working conditions for people in the Dublin Tramway Company, and even more bizarrely that these were considered really good jobs.
Oh, they were,
yeah. But could you describe what the conditions were?
Well, they had what we would now call 0-hour contracts. In other words, you applied for a job and you'd be taken on initially as a casual, which meant that you didn't know if you were working tomorrow or not, but you were on standby, and whenever one of the permanent crew was off for any reason, then you'd take his place. And if you did that for 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 years, if you're lucky, you might be made permanent. If you were permanent or if you were casual, there were very, very strict rules. You could often be working 12 hours or more in a day. You couldn't, if you were rude to a passenger, it was a sackable offence. There are cases of employees, conductors usually, they'd have more interaction with passengers, being ordered to go up to, in their own time of course and at their own expense, to the door of a passenger, a customer, and apologise in person if they were rude or being perceived to be rude. There were rigorous checks obviously on things like pay on fares and takings and that sort of thing, and there was no appeal against dismissal. But having said that, yes, it was, even though they were paid about 20% less than their counterparts in Belfast or Bristol, it was considered a very, very good job. And they'd been earning about 23 to 27 shillings a week, which was a lot of money in those days. And I think one of the reasons for resentment amongst the police of the tramway workers was that, if you're at the lower end of the scale for a DMP constable, you're actually earning less than a tram worker, and a policeman was regarded as a very well paid job.
And could you give us some background to how the dispute began?
It began because actually there was a unique chance of industrial peace in Dublin at that time. There'd been a lot of unrest, as John was saying, in Britain. In 1911, 1912, there were massive strikes, which led to major victories and some defeats for the workers. But employers here were very badly rattled. There were about 30 disputes in Dublin in the first half of 1913, increases between 20 and 25% secured by Larkin for his members in different industries. And then he began to organise in the Tramway Company and in Guinness's. The Archbishop of Dublin at the time, Dr. William Walsh, was a very progressive figure, and he sponsored a conciliation scheme under the auspices of the Lord Mayor, where employers and unions would come together and set up a mediation board to try and resolve disputes without strikes. And that had gone so far as agreement by the Chambers of Commerce and other business bodies in the city and the unions to get involved. But coincidentally, Murphy had been out sick for the early part of 1913. About February 1913 until July, he was fairly ill, too ill to work, which was unusual. But when he came back, he was horrified to learn that Larkin was organising his workers in the tram company. So he called a meeting at midnight on July the 19th, 1913. He picked midnight on that night because it was a Saturday night, and it meant that the men could come after work without disturbing the schedules, and then they could walk home and ponder his words, as they walked. You got to remember, Dublin was much smaller then. Most of them, it would only take 2 or 3 miles walk to get home. They could ponder his words on the way home, and the incentive to go was a mug of cocoa and a sandwich. But when they got there to the Antion concert rooms in Pearse Street, which are now gone, unfortunately, but when they got there, he said basically, you can be in Larkin's union or you can work for me, but you can't have it both ways. So he gave him an ultimatum, and he was as good as his word. As soon as that meeting was over, he began systematically sacking known union members, and by August he'd sacked about 600 out of 800 transport union members in the company. And eventually the workers went back to Larkin and demanded that he bring them out, because they said, if you don't bring us out, we'll all be sacked. And against his better judgment, it has to be said, he decided to bring them out rather than have the humiliation of them leaving the union and denouncing him and saying it was all a waste of time. So he brought them out on Tuesday the 26th of August. They say it was the start of the horse show week, which it was, but that wasn't the reason. The reason was simply that they had a meeting the previous night where he gave them the ultimatum, and he said, OK, lads, you can come out. And it was so sudden that, unlike most strikes, they didn't actually get to serve their claim until after they come out on strike. It went in the following afternoon. The reason they stopped at 9:40 in the morning is interesting as well. Normally with a tram strike or a bus strike or a rail strike, you have mass pickets at the depot before any vehicles leave the station. But he knew they wouldn't have the numbers. He knew they'd all been replaced by scabs, basically, or blacklegs. So he looked at the schedule and he picked 9:40 because that was a time when most of the trams with union members on them were closest to Nelson's Pillar, which was a node of a system. And with trams or trains, if you stop one tram, you stop every tram. So the idea was, if we stopped them, they would cause maximum disruption. Yeah. So he did that, and some of the drivers even took the handles with them off the tram. He had a handle to steer it to stop them being used. But Murphy was ready, and he had spare crews with spare handles on standby in the offices in O'Connell Street. So as soon as the tram stopped, he sent out these crews, and within 40 minutes the trams were up and running again. But it was a great dramatic movement and a moment. So that was the start of what became the lockout.
I think one of the other issues that plays into the dispute as well is Murphy's control of the media in Dublin. How did he deal with workers in the Independent and the Herald?
Well, that's a very good point, Carl, that he did actually, even before some of the tram strike erupted, he began to sack transport members in the dispatch department, which was the only area they had significant numbers in the Independent, and he began sacking newsboys who were in the Independent. In a way, actually, Larkin and the Labour movement were better off then, media-wise, than we are now. Murphy controlled the Irish Independent, the Sunday Independent, which was even then the biggest selling newspapers. The Irish Catholic, controlled all those titles. But Larkin had the Irish Worker, and the Irish Worker was the most successful radical newspaper in the history of this state, this country. It sold on a good week 20,000 copies, on a bad week 5,000. A lot would depend on how much money was in the coffers to print them. He had a deal with the newsboys whereby it cost a bit more. But he gave a bigger commission. So if you were selling a copy of the Irish Worker, you got a halfpenny commission on it. If you were selling a copy of the Indo, you only got a farthing commission on it. So if you're a newsboy, obviously it paid you to sell more Irish Workers. But I mean, when you think about it today, we don't have that. I mean, all of the media are controlled to a greater or lesser extent by big business. So in a way, Larkin was better off, but it was a very powerful weapon.
The numbers seem bizarre compared to the circulation of left-wing newspapers in the last 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
A powerful weapon as well for getting your voice across to the ordinary people in Dublin.
Yes, I know it was, and the Sunday Independent, interesting enough, sold about 55,000 copies at that time, every day. It only really began to increase during the First World War, funnily enough. But what's interesting as well is during the lockout, British tabloid papers, there were only really two of them then, the Sketch and the Mirror. They began to increase sales in Dublin very significantly. I think it was because they were much more sympathetic to the workers than obviously Murphy was, or the Freeman's Journal, which was the Irish Party paper.
Just before we leave that point, I mean, we're very much looking at a Red Scare here, though, aren't we? I mean, we're looking at Larkin as a revolutionary, he's a socialist, he's going to bring down the social order, he's going to destroy the family, he's going to destroy religion. Isn't it? Those are the kind of things that the newspapers are saying.
It is, and the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, particularly the Catholic Church. You've got to remember that the Irish Party and the Catholic Church have been working to get home rule in the country for 40 years. And then Parnell stymied it all up by having his affair with Kitty O'Shea and all that, and split the party, and they came together. So after 40 years, you've finally got a Home Rule Bill through Parliament. You've been telling the Liberals and you've been telling the Labour Party in British House of Commons that you're all one big happy family, that everyone in Ireland wants Home Rule except for these nasty Protestants in the north, and they're a minority and a planted minority, and they shouldn't be there in the first place. So that's your sort of script. And then suddenly you have these people coming out of the woodwork saying, well, we're not actually all that happy about it, and we're more interested in decent wages and housing conditions than whether we have home rule or not. So it was seen as a form of treachery. Larkin was actually quite a committed Catholic. I wouldn't say he was a devout Catholic, but he actually was a practicing and believing Catholic. So that made it a bit more difficult to attack him. But nevertheless, it was very easy generally to paint the trade union movement, socialists, as syndicalists, and as atheists and antichrists, and that tactic was used very, very effectively. The Dublin poor were very devout. I mean, organisations like the Vincent de Paul were very strong. I mean, there were something like 1,300 clergy in Dublin at that time, and these are full-time professionals, if you like, who have nothing else to do except promote the Catholic faith and attack anyone who crosses their path and challenges it. They were normally locked in a war with Protestant clergymen, who were far fewer in number but better off, fighting about other things like proselytism, education of children. But suddenly they had this new threat, so they turned their guns on the trade union movement instead. And Murphy helped there because there was a scheme to bring Irish children, strikers' children, to Britain to be looked after during the strike. And one of the things that Murphy's papers did, they started publishing the names and addresses of parents who had given consent for their children to go to Britain to be looked after there.
So we had quite a bitter strike, but involving tramway workers, but it becomes something much bigger. Can you talk about how it escalated?
Sure. I mean, in some ways, Murphy was Larkin's biggest convert, because he reckoned that the only thing that could defeat syndicalism and a threat of a general strike by the workers was a general lockout by the employers. So it was quite an achievement, because when you think about it, only a couple of weeks beforehand, the employers were willing to enter a mediation system to sort of curb the excesses of the labour movement and cut a deal that would let's talk about these things, negotiate sensibly and avoid strikes as much as possible. And he got over 400 of them to agree to band together in the Dublin Employers Federation, of which he was leader, and he was also president of the Chamber of Commerce that year, to band together and agree they would hold the line. They would lock out any worker who's in the transport union, and they gave all their employees a pledge. It varied slightly, but the gist of it was, Joe Bloggs, either I'm not a member of the Transport Union and won't join, I am a member but I'm going to leave immediately, or I'm not a member of another union, but I give an undertaking that I will never work side by side with a transport worker member. these were handed out and people were told to sign them. And amazingly, people said no. I mean, bricklayers said no, carpenters said no, engineers said no. Every union, practically every union, there were one or two exceptions, but the vast majority of other trade unions refused to sign the pledge, and they were all locked out. So in a very short space of time, you had 25,000 workers laid off because they wouldn't bow down to this ultimatum.
I mean, it is extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, you've got all the media on one side, you've got all the employers, and yet people are, on a point of principle, really refusing to sign a pledge.
I think actually, ironically, one of the reasons they were so determined and so courageous was they had nothing to lose. I mean, if you're living in a slum, and you're earning a very small wage, and you can never hope to live anywhere else or do any better under the present system, you haven't got that much to lose. Also, the other big factor that we tend to forget now, and it arises from Bloody Sunday, is the massive support from the British trade union movement. And I think history has been very unfair, Irish Labour historians included, and particularly like Desmond Greaves, in painting the British unions as some sort of traitors or selling out the Dublin working class, when it was really quite the reverse that happened. And after the tramway strike began, and before the lockout began, there were riots already in the city. The riots happened in the city because of ironically again, because Murphy's plans to counteract this strike was so effective that the trams were working fairly normally, so people began stoning the trams, and so they didn't run after dark. So then that erupted, that escalated into actual rioting. And on the Saturday after the tram strike began, there was very serious rioting from Ringsend as far as the north in the city. And the Larkin had called a meeting, one of several meetings, in O'Connell Street for the following Sunday, August the 31st. And it was actually the police magistrates who did it, but they did it in the name of the government. They proclaimed the meeting, they banned it, they said it couldn't take place. Now, things were so volatile at that stage, and there were already a couple of people killed, at least 2 or 3 people killed as a result of that rioting, that the Trades Council got together. Larkin was on the run. He'd broken bail. He was on the run, threatening to have his meeting in O'Connell Street. The rest of the Trades Council met together. They met with the local policeman, Willoughby, who was castigated as a black-hearted Irishman in other situations, but apparently he was quite a sensible individual, and he actually saved Sean O'Casey from hiding on more than one occasion by his own members because they were fellow parishioners in Church of Ireland. But anyway, Willoughby agreed, or got agreement from Dublin Castle, that if they held a rally outside Liberty Hall in the morning, and if they marched out to Fairview, where the Transport Union had a recreational facility, where Marino is basically a housing estate now, that would be grand, that they'd let off steam, they'd make their protest, and it would diffuse the situation. So that's what they did. But while they all marched off to Fairview with all the trade unionists, about 10,000 trade unionists went on that march. Larkin managed to get himself smuggled into the Imperial Hotel in O'Connell Street, which was owned by Murphy, and he made a brief appearance on a balcony. And meanwhile, O'Connell Street was lined from end to end with not just DMP but Royal Irish Constabulary members, because the DMP was so overstretched at this stage that Bloody Sunday happened, and the rest of the say is history.
Well, Pádraig, we'll have to continue that story about Larkin and the Imperial Hotel just after the break. We're going to take a very quick break, and then we will be back with Pádraig Yeates. Now, Pádraig, you were beginning to tell the story there about Larkin's appearance on the Imperial Hotel on that day that the crowds began to mass on O'Connell Street. What happened that day?
Basically, what happened was, with the help of one of the Gifford sisters, I think it was Nellie Gifford, but one of them helped, and Countess Markovich, he got Count Markovich's dress frock coat, I should say, and his I think his tall hat and his general regalia. He must have been a big man like Larkin, and they fitted Larkin. And he went in with one of the Giffords, and they had luggage and that, but she did all the talking, and he booked the room for her elderly uncle, Mr. Donnelly, and nobody at the desk noticed that the monogram on the cases and that was M for Markovich. But anyway, he couldn't speak because his voice was so distinctive, so well known in Dublin, that he'd be instantly recognisable. So they went up to the room on the first floor, the bedroom overlooking the street, and when he got into the room there was a big asbestos plant in the window. So he removed the plant, and then he found he couldn't open the window. It had been bolted shut I don't think it was just unfortunate. So he then had to run down the corridor into the dining room, and he ran through the dining room, which is on the first floor, out onto the balcony, and began to address the crowd. And what happened then was, as I said earlier, the police had lined the street just to make sure there was no trouble. And for whatever reason, every officer on the street over the rank of sergeant ran into the building to arrest Larkin. So the crowd surged forward. It wasn't the trade union crowd. They'd all gone off to Fairview. It was day trippers, it was sightseers, it was people. Masco was coming back from Mass probably to go for lunch or go home for lunch or even dine in some of the hotels. And we know that from the evidence given subsequently in an inquiry. But the crowd surged forward to hear what was being said. And the police sergeant in front of what is now Cleary's, a brick was thrown or a stone was thrown and broke a window, and he told his men to drive the crowd back. Now, he always said that he never told them to draw their batons, but I suppose if you're a good policeman, crowd, sorry, what else do you do? So they drove the crowd back. The crowd fled across the street towards Princes Street, which is by the GPO, which in those days, and up until very recently, was the rear entrance to independent newspapers. And the policeman there had been briefed in great detail about whatever you do, don't let any damage occur to William Martin Murphy's property. So when they saw this crowd surging towards them, actually trying to escape from the police on the other side of the street, they laid into them as well. So we don't know. Figures vary from about 400 to 600 people were seriously injured as a result. But that went down as the first Bloody Sunday in the 20th century in Ireland. And the next morning, what was really important about it actually wasn't. People find this hard to understand, but of all the commemorations, I mean, none of them would have happened if we hadn't been part of the United Kingdom. I mean, there would be no War of Independence, obviously, if we hadn't been part of the United Kingdom. But there would have been no lockout, because what happened then was all the British papers had these pictures, shock horror, the Manchester Guardian, the Mirror, the Sketch, the Times, had all these pictures of people being battened on the streets. And it coincided the next morning with the beginning of the TUC conference in Manchester. And as delegates were going in there, they all had their newspapers. And what would normally happen if you have a strike somewhere and you have a conference, there'd be a delegation would tell you, we're having a strike, we'd out for 6 months or whatever, and you'd give them a vote of support, and you'd have a collection outside afterwards. As delegates went out, they'd throw money in the buckets and so on. But on this occasion, people were so outraged that when William Partridge, one of the strike leaders, had made it on the mailboat over to Manchester, when he gave a personal eyewitness account of what had happened on the street, people got so angry that they overturned the top table and they pledged unconditional support to the Dublin strikers. So suddenly you had the entire resources of the British trade union movement supporting the workers in Dublin, and that kept the strike going for 5 months. Nearly every week a ship would come across from the Mersey Ship Canal, from Liverpool, from Manchester, Salford, with food and money and fuel to help the strikers. Nearly £100,000 was sent in that way. And there was other funds came in as well, but £100,000, which could multiply roughly, it'd be worth about 20 million in today's money. It's hard to make comparisons because obviously they didn't have colour TVs or mobile phones, but in fact it meant the money would go a lot further because it was buying bread. In fact, there was an increase in intestinal diseases amongst children in Dublin that autumn, and I think the reason might well be some kids were eating fresh meat or condensed milk for the first time in their lives, and probably their stomachs, their intestinal system digestive system couldn't cope with the food. So suddenly you had this surge of support, which Murphy hadn't reckoned on. Now Murphy survived it, and the Dublin employees survived it only really because of subsidies from the British Shipping Federation and from Lord Ivy, the head of the Guinness dynasty, but particularly the Shipping Federation. In a way, it's a bit like the Spanish Civil War, that that labour and capital in Britain knew that the stakes here were very high, because if Larkin won in Dublin, it meant they could be in for another round of industrial unrest in Britain in 1914. And similarly, the employers knew if they could beat this threat into the ground, if they could kill off Larkinism at its root, that would be a victory for everybody as well. So the stakes became very high as a result of that. Interesting enough, well-off Dubliners did not sympathise with the lockout. I'll just give you an example of that. Murphy launched a loyal tramway workers fund, which was to give money, a bonus if you like, to the men who were breaking the strike, and they collected £1,300 in the space of 6 weeks, and then Murphy wound up the scheme. That was just in the Irish Times. There was more money from other sources, but from readers of the Irish Times, he wound it up because the tramway men were getting so much money, he was afraid they'd stop working. So they wound it up. But in the entire lockout, there was only £2,500 collected to relieve distress in the city, even though the money being collected, it was specifically not to help strikers. And we tend to forget that the people worst affected by the lockout were not the strikers, who at least had strike money from their unions and from Britain. It was hawkers, it was non-union workers who actually had nothing to fall back on.
One of the blogs, the history blogs, Come Here To Me, was talking about this a couple of months ago, was about a Shelbourne and Bohemians match, and the issue of strike breakers or scabs playing for Bohemians.
That's well. It was. I've never seen it authenticated, I must say. But yeah, the riots actually began. There was a lot of unrest. There was stoning of trams and that. But on the Saturday after the tramway strike began, that would be on August the 30th, there was a match in Shelbourne Park where the visiting team were Bohemians, and there was a rumour going around that there were scabs on the Bows team. And when they arrived outside the grounds, there was a picket to stop them getting in, and there was a bit of pushing and shoving and argy-bargy, nothing too serious. And then suddenly someone saw a tram coming over Ringsend Bridge, and they said, "Oh, there's one of Murphy's trams." So they all ran off, the crowd all ran off to stone the tram, and the riot actually began in Ringsend. But it spread all along Pearse Street and jumped across the river into Gardiner Street, Marlborough Street, Sean McDermott Street, all those areas as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was the same weekend that the police actually broke into people's houses to beat them up in revenge for having been out rioting. Is that true?
Oh, they did, yeah. There were 30 policemen injured in the Corporation Street area alone on Saturday night, and on Bloody Sunday, after dispersing the crowds in O'Connell Street, the police, led by Sergeant Wolfe, who was the end man of the tug of war team, so he was a very big man, he led a group into Corporation buildings, which had just been built. I know they became a byword for slums later, but they were the very first purpose-built flats built by Dublin's Corporation for tenants in the city. So they were the state-of-the-art of that, and they broke into the flats and they wrecked them systematically. Any furniture was thrown out, and certainly above the ground floor, it was thrown out over the balconies into the courtyard. Any religious statues, the only thing that people could really afford, apart from a few basic utensils and furniture, were these little chalk statues, Child of Prague and Sacred Heart and all the Blessed Virgin type statues. And the policemen seemed to take great delight in smashing them to bits with their batons, just to teach these people, they weren't entitled to anything. And one man, whose name unfortunately escapes me at the moment, but he was paralysed. He was a former lighthouse keeper, but he was paralysed, and he told him to get out of bed, and he said, "I can't get out of bed," and they took this as a refusal, and they battered him in the bed, and then they dragged him out of the bed anyway, and he died in Jervis Street that evening. His neighbours got him to Jervis Street, carried him to Jervis Street. But that was the same thing happened in Inchicore. The military to restore order, they had to call that, they deployed cavalry in O'Connell Street, and the West Kent Regiment were deployed in Inchicore in support of the police, and apparently soldiers joined the police in wrecking homes in Inchicore as well. On the north side of the city, it was entirely the work of the police. There was a myth then created, of course, that it wasn't really the DMP, it was the RIC who did this, but in fact it was both. And in fact the RIC wouldn't have known where to go to wreck houses if the DMP hadn't taken them there. And it tended to be the Monto area. Interestingly enough, prostitution almost collapsed in the city during the lockout, presumably because people didn't have very much money, and also because the police...
It wasn't a sympathetic strike, was it?
I don't think there's anything that elevated, if that's the right word to use. But it was the police. The police, of course, were busy doing other things. But I mean, there were obviously rackets there in the sense that the police would raid, and prostitution was a very big business in Dublin. I mean, looking at the police statistics, they go up and down, and there's no real rhyme or reason to them. It's hard to believe that it wasn't. That some madams were paying off the police and others weren't, or. Whatever was going on there, there was no structured policing policy on prostitution until the war, when it became a matter of seriousness for the British Army, and they wanted prostitution rooted out, so the police had to cooperate. But I suspect that the police, if you look at Bloody Sunday, the arrests on Bloody Sunday, if you look at the casualties, every social class were battened into the ground. But if you look at the people arrested, they all came from nearly all came from North Inner City, and they were nearly all previously known to the police, as they say. So the police knew who they were arresting. They didn't know who they were battening, but once they were going through the prone bodies or the people staggering around, they knew who to detain and who to let go.
Well, one of the things, especially when you're reading the book, seems to be that scabs or strike breakers could behave any way they liked with impunity once they came before the courts for violence or even discharging firearms. There didn't seem to be any repercussions.
Well, you got to remember that the magistrates, particularly in the county, were all employers. And if you were justice of the peace and sat on the bench, you had the power in those days to issue firearms licenses. So you had employers hiring scabs and then issuing them with firearms. Now, obviously, if your scab or your strikebreaker shot somebody with the firearm you'd authorised, it didn't look too well for you. So, yeah, I mean, there was outrageous cases. I mean, there was a case, for example, where a tramway worker and a free labourer, as they were called, from another firm were attacked on a tram by a crowd, and they opened fire on the crowd from the top of the tram. And when the case came before the courts, they were acquitted as justifiable, defence of themselves with their firearms. But the witnesses, giving evidence that they had fired these guns, were all convicted of rioting and were sent to prison. There was no single free labourer who fired and shot people. It has to be said, sent to prison. They, in one case where one man was convicted of actually shooting someone, he was basically given the Probation Act. He was told to go back to Wales, where he came from, and that was the end of it. But no, there wasn't a single firearms case where anyone was served time in prison. Whereas, on the other hand, as you say, there were cases where, I suppose the most tragic case and the one most forgotten was at Heaton's coal yard in Dunleary, where James Byrne, who was a former coal heaver himself, had been made branch secretary of the local transport union branch, and he was charged with intimidating men who'd gone back to work. He denied the charge. He said it was a frame up. He never did this, and he was told he was remanded. The case was remanded, and he was told he could have bail at £10. He refused to take the bail. He said no, he wasn't. It was a totally false case. He was willing to be tried, but he wasn't going to prison for something he didn't do. So of course they locked him up for contempt. Was it? No, I could be wrong, but certainly he refused bail, and he was sent to prison. Earlier, James Connolly had been sent to prison and had gone on hunger strike and then got on thirst strike and had been released. But Connolly was very well known. Unfortunately for Byrne, he wasn't very well known, and when he was sentenced to prison, hundreds of other people were being sent to prison, and there were other things happening as well. So when he got into prison, he went on hunger strike and nobody paid any attention, so he decided to do a James Connolly on it, and he went on thirst strike, but nobody paid any attention either. And after 6 days, someone in the prison realised this man was dying, so they sent him off to Monkstown Hospital, where he died the next day. But he was the first man to die on hunger strike in Ireland in the 20th century, almost totally unknown. But before Thomas Ashe or Terence McSweeney or any of the much better known names, he was the first man to die on hunger strike, and he was forgotten. There is a little memorial over his grave, and there's a local 1913 committee now in Dunleary, and one of the things they plan to do is erect a plaque in Clarence Street, where he lived before he died.
At this time, the Irish Parliamentary Party would have been the main political movement in the south of Ireland, and a lot of Ulster as well, and especially in Dublin. How did they react to this, and other ancillary bodies like the Hibernians and the United Irish League? What was their response to the lockout?
Well, the reaction of the 6 MPs for Dublin was paralysis, basically. Only one of them, William Field, who was an old Fenian, gave some support to the workers, but even he was fairly guarded in his comments. Most of them said absolutely nothing. It was amazing, really. And in fact, they were even attacked by the Unionists over it, because the Catholic Church really took over the political side of the dispute. Early on in the dispute, there was a rally in the Albert Hall in London, addressed by Jim Larkin, and one of the other speakers was Dora Montefiore. Dora Montefiore, she was young, she was opinionated, she was Jewish, she was a suffragette, she was a socialist. If you were the Catholic Church and you wanted a profile of a hate figure, you'd have to work pretty hard to do better than Dora Montefiore. So she comes over to Dublin to tell the Irish what to do, as they say it. And she has this great, very simple idea, which had been used elsewhere, because there's a strike, because there's so much hardship, let's take some of the children away to trade unionist homes in Britain. In fairness, so she went out of her way to get homes of Catholic trade unionists in Britain. She got 300 homes agreed to take children in an initial tranche. So she came to Dublin, she went to Liberty Hall, hundreds of mothers came to Liberty Hall to have their children put on the list. So the next, that was on the weekend after the Albert Hall rally. On the Monday morning, she took the kids to Tara Street Baths, where the Markovich Baths are now, to get them cleaned up and give them new clothes. When they came out, there was a howling mob led by a couple of curates from Westland Road Church. The priests seized the children, they took them off their own parents. A small group of parents who refused to be intimidated and hand over the children were actually practically stoned and chased back to Liberty Hall. Every attempt after that to take children out of the city was defeated. Almost every attempt. About half a dozen children got out of the city, but the vast majority was stopped. And as William Martin Murphy actually started publishing names and addresses of parents who gave their consent to all this. On one occasion, when a group was stopped, one of Dora Montefiore's helpers, a woman called Lucille Rand, who was an American, who was herself a Catholic, whose father was a member of the American Senate, who'd been married by the papal nuncio in Portugal or somewhere, and who was one of the helpers on this, was charged with receiving a child of 8 years old, knowing him to be stolen. So when she appeared in court, Dora Montefiore went and gave evidence in her defence. So at the end of giving her evidence, Dora Montefiore was charged with kidnapping. So the two women, the charges were dropped against them on condition that they agreed to leave Ireland and never come back. And as far as I know, they never did. They never did for some mysterious reason. But anyway, that was the sort of the level of Frances Sheehy Skeffington, who was a well-known campaigner for women's rights and socialist ideas and workers' rights, was almost kicked to death in Euston Station by a mob led by the head of John Dillon Nugent, who was the secretary of the Ancient Order of Hibernians in Ireland, and two other priests were charged with him. Now, it subsequently, of course, as always happens in Ireland, for some reason the cases against them were lost or withdrawn or whatever, and there were just some charges left of some their acolytes, some poor unfortunates who didn't amount to very much socially. And Francis Sheehy Skeffington, in fairness to himself, withdrew the evidence, refused to give evidence against what he called the lackeys if they weren't going to charge the main culprits in the attack. So the church the church succeeded in keeping far more children. The church succeeded in stopping the movement of children in and out of Dublin to a degree that the workers never succeeded in stopping the movement of goods in and out of Dublin.
Pádraig, for all we can see that the forces of power were very much ranged against the workers, but for all of their solidarity and for all the help they were getting from Britain, the strike was totally defeated in the end. So can you talk about how the strike ended and how the workers were defeated?
It ended on a damn squib, as defeated strikes always do. It was defeated basically because the Dublin employers were, I think most people would accept, totally unreasonable in their position. Sir George Asquith was sent over by the Liberal government. He was their chief troubleshooter, and he'd resolved a lot of disputes. And Asquith held hearings in Dublin Castle, and at those hearings he heard both sides. Himself and his fellow tribunal members, he had an employer and a union rep on the tribunal with him. They issued their proposals to settle the strike. The proposals were accepted by the unions and rejected immediately by the employers. Every attempt at a resolution failed. Some of them came quite close to settling it towards the end of the dispute, but I suppose that the big stumbling block was the employers wouldn't give an undertaking that they would re-employ everybody. They just refused absolutely. And given that the workers hadn't secured any increases or for themselves or had any improvement in their conditions, the one thing that they didn't want to face was total victimisation. And yet the employers wouldn't give that assurance. The furthest they would go is that they would re-employ people as best they could, circumstances permitting, the usual let-out clauses. So they never bridged that gap. So the British TUC, you've got to remember, had its own problems and its own strikes, and there was huge amounts of money going to support the strike in Dublin. It wasn't succeeding. Larkin had been his own worst enemy. He was a very volatile individual, and he had a great rapport with the crowd. He had a great way of motivating the workers in Dublin and organising them, but he also had a great way of antagonising British trade union leaders. On one occasion, for example, I think it was in the Albert Hall again, he called the British TUC leadership about as useful as mummies in a museum in terms of supporting the strike. Mark Lew, who was the president of the British Socialist Party, which gave more money per head of member than any other group anywhere on these islands, he refused to speak on a platform with Mark Lew because Mark Lew was a divorcee. And as a Catholic, he couldn't possibly go on a platform with a divorcee. So, some of these things were totally gratuitous. But that was Larkin. And eventually, even his own supporters reached a point where he could no longer defend him. So, Larkin's grand strategy, and who was supported in this by Connolly and the other strike leaders, was that they would call a special TUC conference and get all goods from Dublin blacked in Britain. That proposal was heard at a special delegate conference, the very first special delegate conference ever held at the British TUC, and there wasn't another one held until 1984 on the miners' strike. So it shows you how big this dispute was. It was defeated by more than 10-1, the delegates, when they voted. But the reason for that was that it just wouldn't have worked. It couldn't work. Larkin had 50% of the dockers in Dublin unionised. The average unionisation figure on the British docks was 15%. Now, if Larkin couldn't stop the movement of goods in and out of Dublin with 50% of the workforce unionised, what hope was there of the British workers doing it? And besides, they had their own disputes and their own concerns as well. So the TUC leadership eventually reached the end of the line and said, look, we can't give you any more. We're bled dry. Well, probably wasn't true, but they were certainly a lot poorer than they were at the beginning of it. Larkin himself became a divisive figure within the British labour movement. So they said, we can't give you any more money. It dried up. But it was a classic blame the Brits thing that, ironically enough, after they were defeated, Connolly wrote a letter to Larkin saying, we're going to have to blame this on the Brits now. We're going to have to call it off. We're going to have to end the strike, but we can blame the TUC for it. So I think that was very unfair. That you can criticise the individual British trade union leaders, their handling of it. You can criticise the overall strategy to some extent, but I think at the end they did as much and more than you could ever expect from a trade union movement. And certainly Irish workers have never given the same solidarity, never had occasion to, I suppose, to British workers that was given in 1913. It was a genuine class war. It was a genuine cross-border war. It was the only event of those years in Ireland where the allegiance of people to their class or their union or their employer, if they're an employer to their class, to their employer organisations, took precedence over whether you were a Catholic or a Protestant, whether you were a nationalist or a unionist.
Now, I'd just like to talk to you about the commemoration coming up next year for the 100th anniversary and your role as well with the committee that's organising it. What type of events do you have planned? How do you see the commemoration going?
The event, the emphasis is, I'd say my role in it is I'm sort of coordinator with the committee, which it's a fairly broad committee, but I suppose the core elements in it are SIPTU, which is in direct descent, if you like, from the Transport Union. Jim Larkin and James Connolly were the founding fathers of the union, and the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. But the emphasis has been very much on participatory events. One thing we have up and running already is the creation of a 1913 tapestry, which involves people primarily at the moment from the art and crafts sector, but trade unions have expressed an interest in getting involved. So we're still at the teething stage, but there's some panels being made at the moment. A Bloody Sunday panel is being done, a panel with Larkin in it is being done, and another panel. And when we've gotten through those teething problems, the hope is that other people who've expressed an interest, who mightn't have a high level of skill or any skill, will be able to be fed into the production process. It's being designed by Robert Balla and Cathy Henderson, who are two well-known artists in Ireland. They're designing it for us. So that's one project. There's a number of others. It'd be impossible to go through them all, but the Irish Congress of Trade Unions are going to have a major public consciousness raising, if you like, series of events. There's going to be a 1913 module for schools. There's already a Youth Connect programme for schools. I think it's in over 400 schools at second level, where people are told, trade unions go in on a voluntary basis and explain to older second level youngsters what their rights are at work, about trade unionism internationally, about problems of child labour in other countries and so on. So we hope to add to that another module on the lockout itself. So that's another proposal. We're still hoping to get a tenement museum off the ground, because I think if you look at the 1916 Rising, when there was an inquiry into that, one of the chief findings of it was that the existence of slums, and particularly the tenements in Dublin, were a major factor in causing unrest in the city. So that was, if you like, the breathing ground for revolutionary ideas from 1913 right the way through to the Civil War. So we're hoping to get a museum off the ground on that. We're hoping to have a banners exhibition. We found there's banners in storage in the National Museum. There's banners in trade union offices in the Labour History Society. There's banners in Manchester relating to that period, and we hope National Museum has indicated it will help us there. We're hoping to do work with the Glasnevin Cemetery Heritage Trust with Shane McThomas, who I think is very well known in Dublin for all his work highlighting the historical importance of Glasnevin. So we're hoping to link in with him on that. Dublin Port are willing to facilitate an exhibition, and we have found a marvellous record, which is a record of all the manual employees of the port in the lockout period. So we know we can find out. It's a bit like the GPO and the pension applications. We'll be able to find out who actually was on strike in 1913 and who says they're on strike in 1913. So there's things like that. There's various publications coming out. One of the big things we hope to do is a dramatisation of the Asquith inquiry. It was very dramatic, the evidence given. Some of it was quite horrific, and the exchanges between people like Larkin and Murphy at that inquiry. So there's the bones of a drama there. The OPW have indicated they're willing to provide us with Dublin State Apartments where the hearing was originally held, if we can find a production company to do it. We haven't found a production company to do it yet, but I hope someone out there will be listening and will do that. And you know, there's loads of other things we can on all night about it. But
and finally, Pádraig, one of these very broad and very difficult to answer questions: what does 1913 mean in 2013?
Well, the fun, it hasn't gone away. Trade union recognition. People went on strike in 1913 to have the right to be in a trade union and be represented by that trade union with their employers. In Ireland today, we're one of only 3 countries in the European Union where people do not have a legal right to be represented in the workplace. Should they so choose, we're not saying it's compulsory. But if you want to be in a union, there's only 3 countries, I think Greece and Malta are the other 2, where you cannot go into your employer and say, look, I'm in a union, I'd like them to represent me, and the employer can say, get lost.
Well, unfortunately, we have to come to an end now. We could probably talk for another hour on this, but we'd really like to thank Pádraig Yeates, and would encourage all the listeners to keep an eye on the events that are planned for the commemoration, or if you have anything that you know that could be of use to them or want to get involved, get in contact with Pádraig at SIP2. I'd like to thank my co-presenter John Dorney. My name is Cathal Brennan, and if you want to listen to this or previous episodes of The History Show, just go to the podcast page on www.near.ie.